Stop calling it anxiety. Stop calling it stress. What you are experiencing is psychic hemorrhaging. You step away from the interaction, and the physical symptoms are undeniable. The shaking hands, the cold sweat, the profound hollowness in the chest. They did not strike you. They did not utter a socially recognized insult, yet you feel violated, as if a vital organ has been removed without anesthesia. This is the cold, hard truth of psychological injury. The psyche is an objective reality, and it has been brutalized. The modern human being, especially those who strive for what society defines as goodness, politeness, empathy, patience, is suffering from an epidemic of structural neurosis. You have been meticulously crafting your persona, your social mask, to be acceptable, cooperative, and kind. You follow the rules of decent society. You assume that if you present a well-integrated, functioning self, others will respond in kind. This assumption is your greatest liability. The issue is not that they are simply bad people. Such simplistic moralizing avoids the clinical diagnosis. The problem is that you are interacting with individuals who are not governed by their conscious ego, but are instead possessed by autonomous complexes. These complexes are fragments of the psyche, often born from profound trauma and repression, that have gained independence and operate like parasites. When the partner gaslights you, or the colleague smiles while systematically undermining your work, you are not dealing with a rational entity capable of guilt or remorse. You are dealing with a mechanism, a psychological automaton that seeks one thing: supply your attention, your confusion, your pain, your desperate need for validation. These are the psychic resources, the energy, that the complex demands to sustain its illusory sense of power. You make the fatal error of projection. You project your own conscience onto them. You believe that if you explain your hurt, if you meticulously detail the logic of your position, they will suddenly see the light and cease the destructive behavior. You assume they operate on your moral operating system. They do not. The toxic individual is driven by a deep, archaic fear of insignificance, a terrifying void at the core of their being. Their complex compensates for this terrifying emptiness by attempting to control the external world, specifically your emotional reality. When they succeed in making you doubt yourself, when they successfully ruin your day with a passive-aggressive comment, they momentarily feel whole. They have successfully extracted the required energy. And here is where the neurosis of the nice person becomes structural. You continue to prioritize your persona over your survival. You would rather bleed out while maintaining the illusion of decency, the social requirement to be understanding, patient, and forgiving, than engage the brutal reality of the confrontation. You are addicted to the moral high ground, even if it means you are constantly being slaughtered on the low ground. This is psychological suicide. The core conflict is not a misunderstanding. It is the clash between your conscious, civilized ego and the raw, archaic, instinctual patterns operating through the other person. You bring the carefully curated structure of your social self, your bouquet of polite reasoning, to a fight that is being waged by the unconscious, by the raw power of the shadow. You must accept the objective reality of the situation. When you try to explain your feelings, you are not building a bridge, you are handing them ammunition. When you get angry, you are not standing up for yourself, you are giving the complex the psychic meal it craves. The moment you give them an emotional reaction, any reaction, they win. Look at the exhaustion. Look at the shaking hands. This is the nervous system screaming the truth that your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. You are being drained systematically, and you are allowing it because you are afraid of the judgment that comes from being seen as cold, ruthless, or unnice. The path toward psychic integrity, toward individuation, demands a brutal confrontation with reality. You must stop trying to heal them. You must stop trying to save them. The responsibility for their fragmented psyche is theirs alone. Your responsibility is the preservation of your own psychic structure. If you continue to treat a structural pathology like a minor disagreement, your ruin is inevitable. The first step towards self-preservation is the necessary sacrifice. You must kill the part of you that craves their approval, the part that insists on maintaining the nice guy or nice girl facade, even when it means your annihilation. That craving for external approval is the handle they use to open your structure and drain your vitality. It must be amputated. The world is not as you wish it to be. It is as it is. And for those afflicted by autonomous destructive complexes, the reality is one of extraction and control. Until you integrate your own shadow, until you are capable of wielding the cold, precise awareness required to defend your boundaries, you will remain a battery for their neurosis. The choice is stark: maintain your polite facade and face psychic depletion, or accept the necessary burden of becoming psychologically effective. The silence that follows effective defense is the only true peace. The structural pathology that permits this draining dynamic is rooted in what I termed the persona, the functional mask adopted by the individual in response to the demands of the collective. It is not inherently evil. It is a necessary skin, a shell designed for social navigation. Every civilized person wears one, a compromise between the unique reality of the individual and the expectations of the herd. But when this mask ceases to be a flexible instrument and becomes a rigid, concrete identity, a fortress instead of a doorway, we witness the onset of acute neurosis. This is the cold, hard truth about the toxic individual. They are not merely behaving badly. They are victims of a fatal identification with their own public facade. They have mistaken the costume for the actor. When the ego fuses entirely with the persona, be it the good citizen, the irreproachable parent, or the visionary leader, all psychological material that contradicts this immaculate image must be violently repressed. This is the formation of the shadow. The shadow is not just inconvenient habits. It is the sum total of all rejected, unlived, and unacceptable aspects of the personality: the selfishness, the rage, the incompetence, the sheer brutality required for survival. Psychologically, energy cannot be destroyed, it can only be displaced. By refusing to integrate the shadow, the toxic person creates a powerful, autonomous complex in the unconscious. This complex, the dark brother, gains power precisely because it is denied conscious recognition. It becomes a system with its own will, a splinter personality devoted to sabotage and destruction. This is the psychological engine driving the manipulator. The shining virtuous persona is a brittle shell that demands constant external validation to prevent the repressed shadow from bursting through. The moment they feel their persona is threatened, the moment they feel insignificant, exposed, or challenged, the shadow complex takes over and seeks to stabilize the structure through external control. They must project the unacceptable contents of their own psyche onto you. When they accuse you of being selfish, they are not describing your behavior. They are describing the shadow they refuse to own. When they accuse you of hostility, they are projecting their own subterranean rage. They are playing a shell game with their own identity, and you are merely the convenient surface upon which they deposit their psychic waste. Your mistake, the mistake of the psychologically naive, is viewing this projection as a genuine statement about your character. You attempt to defend yourself against a complex that has nothing to do with you. You argue with the projection, feeding the complex the very energy it needs to sustain itself. Consider the parent identified solely with the persona of selfless martyr. To maintain this rigid identity, all their deep-seated resentment, control issues, and manipulative instincts are shunted into the shadow. That shadow then operates autonomously, using the language of love and concern, the vocabulary of the persona, to inflict maximum psychic damage. They use guilt like a poison because guilt is the easiest way to control an adult who still believes in the parent's immaculate facade. You leave the conversation shaking because you have been in direct contact, not with a stable human being, but with a highly charged, unstable psychic structure. You were drained because you were used as a vessel to contain their own unlived darkness. The pathology is the disconnection from internal reality. The toxic person cannot tolerate the fact that they are flawed, messy, and fundamentally human. They have committed a psychological suicide by sacrificing their totality to uphold a social image. They are functionally hollowed out, which is why they must constantly siphon vitality from others. They are attempting to fill an existential void with your emotional reaction. To defend yourself, you must stop playing the game of the persona. You must stop trying to convince their mask that you are good, reasonable, or deserving of respect. The mask cannot hear you. It is deafened by its own internal necessity to remain flawless. This is where the necessary coldness comes in. You must treat their accusations and projections not as personal attacks, but as clinical symptoms of a profound structural instability. When they project their shadow onto you, You must refuse to catch it. You must refuse to internalize it. This requires the integration of your own shadow, the capacity to be ruthless, detached, and strategically silent when necessary. If you're afraid of being seen as cold, you are still addicted to the approval of the collective, and thus you are still playing by the manipulator's rules. The willingness to be disliked, the capacity to stand alone in your own psychic integrity, is the ultimate psychological defense. The toxic person fears two things above all else: exposure and irrelevance. When you react emotionally, you confirm their significance. You validate the power of their complex. When you remain detached, silent, and entirely unaffected, you deny the persona its vital supply, and you deny the shadow a place to land its projection. You render them irrelevant the moment you stop arguing about whether you are, in fact, too sensitive or ungrateful, and instead observe their behavior as a predictable, mechanical output of a fractured psyche. The power dynamic shifts. You move from being a participant in their neurosis to being the clinical observer. This detachment is not apathy, it is psychological sovereignty. It is the only way to avoid becoming the battery they drain. You must accept that their neurosis is a structural pathology that you cannot fix, and you must accept the burden of the necessary defense. The alternative is the slow, systematic erosion of your own consciousness until you, too, are nothing but a hollowed-out echo of their projection. Wake up. The time for polite discourse is over. We have detailed the external pathology, the calculated chaos and projection deployed by the toxic individual. But we must now pivot, turning the analytical lens inward, because the manipulator does not attack you. They attack the weak point in your psychic structure. They exploit the opening. The reason you leave that conversation shaking, feeling hollowed out and stolen from, is not merely the external abuse, it is the internal response. The manipulator is simply a catalyst, pressing a button that activates a highly volatile, self-contained structure within your own mind. I call this structure the complex. The complex is not just a bad memory or a feeling of inadequacy. It is a trauma, a constellation of repressed emotional charges and experiences that has developed its own distinct personality, its own will, and its own dangerous autonomy within the greater system of the psyche. It is, quite literally, a splinter consciousness. It is broken off from the central ego and begun to live its own life underground. Forget the polite notion that you are the rational driver of your decisions. That is a comforting but utterly dangerous delusion. When an autonomous complex is activated, say the abandonment complex, the inferiority complex, or the guilt complex, it shoves the ego aside. It seizes control of the neural pathways. You are suddenly not the driver of your own life. You are a passenger, kidnapped by an invisible internal tyrant. This tyrant, the complex, has only one goal: to repeat the pattern that created it. It compulsively seeks out situations, relationships, and emotional states that confirm its original trauma. It compels you toward the edge of the abyss, demanding that you act out the old, painful script. When the toxic person delivers that subtle, precise jab, "You're too sensitive," or "I only criticize you because I care," they are not speaking to your rational mind. They are calling out your dormant, autonomous complex of insecurity or repressed anger. And that complex answers the call instantly, hijacking your emotional and physiological response. This mechanism explains the profound energy drain. It wasn't you shaking when you walked away. It was the complex, fully activated and consuming vast amounts of psychic energy to sustain its own existence and execute its programmed response. It feeds on the emotional storm it creates. The manipulator gets the supply, but the complex gets the feast. This is a crucial distinction. You are being drained by your own autonomous inner structure, which the external agent merely learned how to trigger. Modern life, with its demands for superficial conformity and relentless positivity, forces us into mass repression. We stuff down fear, genuine anger, shame, and the inherent darkness of the shadow. These repressed contents do not vanish into thin air. They coagulate, they solidify, they become these autonomous complexes running things from the basement of the psyche. We are witnessing an epidemic of neurosis where people are not living their own lives, but are instead acting out the rigid, repetitive scripts written by their internal tyrants. This is the cold, hard reality of psychological science. The complex has more power over your immediate decisions than your conscious will does, especially under stress. It is why you find yourself saying things you swore you wouldn't say, or why you return to relationships that you consciously know are pure poison. The complex demands repetition, and the ego is too weak to resist the compulsion. To achieve true psychological sovereignty, to become truly untouchable by external manipulation, the work must begin inside. You must disarm the internal tyrants first. This is the most difficult, most terrifying part of the process I termed individuation. It requires a confrontation with the contents of your own unconscious. You must stop treating your complex like a flaw you can talk yourself out of. You must treat it like a foreign body that needs surgical removal, or more accurately, deep, painful integration. You must pull these autonomous structures out of the shadows, name their power, and consciously suffer the emotional charge they carry. This is the necessary psychological sacrifice. You must consciously suffer the trauma, or you will be unconsciously controlled by it forever. There is no middle ground. The toxic person is just a mirror reflecting the structural fracture within your own mind. They are the diagnostic tool. If you react violently, if you are easily destabilized, it means you have an unintegrated complex that is ready to be triggered. You are playing a rigged game because your opponent knows exactly where your buttons are, and those buttons are connected to an autonomous power supply that is not under your control. Stop blaming the external world for your internal chaos. Stop trying to reason with the manipulator. That is wasted energy. The only effective path is the ruthless surgical removal of the complex's autonomy. You must integrate the shadow, face the abyss of your own internal programming, and wrest control back from the parts of you that have developed a dangerous will of their own. Until you stop allowing the passenger to drive, you will always be vulnerable to the next toxic agent who walks through the door. The time for polite self-deception is over. Integrate or collapse. That is the choice. The external drama you are caught in, the draining conversations, the invisible wounds, is nothing more than a cheap theatrical distraction. You believe you are fighting an external enemy, a toxic individual? You are wrong. You are merely wrestling with a poorly constructed mirror. The villain in your story is not the person sending you into a panic attack. The villain is the unintegrated content of your own seek projected onto them. Let's be precise. The emotional collapse you experience after a toxic encounter is not solely due to their malice. It is due to the catastrophic structural failure within your own consciousness. The energy you feel stolen was already leaking from an unsealed reservoir within your own mind. The toxic agent merely opened the tap. Why the relentless need for projection? It is the most common form of neurotic self-defense. Facing the reality of your own shadow, the capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and deceit that lies dormant within your unconscious is terrifying. It threatens the entire structure of your carefully curated persona, that socially acceptable mask you wear. It is infinitely easier to point a finger outward and declare, "That person is the source of all evil," than to turn inward and acknowledge, "I possess the potential for that very same darkness." When you are obsessively focused on the flaws of the manipulator, you are not engaging in justice. You are engaging in psychological avoidance. You are using the external conflict as a cheap substitute for the necessary, painful internal conflict. This is the cold, hard truth of the neurosis epidemic. You are not simply a victim. You are a willing participant in a drama designed by your own complexes. You are attracted, compelled, to the very people who embody the aspects of the shadow you have most violently repressed. Think about it. Why does the gaslighter infuriate you so intensely? Because they operate with a ruthless disregard for truth that you, striving desperately to be good, deny yourself. Why does the passive-aggressive coworker destabilize you? Because they embody the cunning aggression that your own structure forbids you from consciously utilizing. The complex is autonomous. It has a will of its own, but it cannot express itself directly into consciousness without causing a mental breakdown. So, it finds a proxy. It finds someone outside, a person who conveniently carries the weight of the repressed material, and then it unleashes its furious energy, your energy, as outrage, despair, or self-pity. You are not fighting them, you are fighting yourself, and you are doing it in the most inefficient, destructive way possible. Stop blaming the external world for the pressure cooker inside your skull. Stop seeking pity for the wounds inflicted by others. That is the language of the victim, and that language is precisely what keeps the complex autonomous and empowered. The moment you declare yourself a victim, you have already ceded control. You have placed the locus of power outside yourself, granting the external agent the authority to define your reality and regulate your emotional state. This is psychological suicide by proxy. The only way to dismantle this structure is to perform the surgical act of owning the projection. You must look at the person who destabilizes you and say, not to them, but to your own seek. What quality in that individual am I refusing to integrate into myself? This is where most people quit. They are addicted to the moral high ground, even if it is the low ground of effectiveness. They prefer the comfort of being the pure, suffering martyr rather than the dangerous, integrated individual. They would rather bleed out slowly than accept the crushing weight of their own complete nature. The integration of the shadow requires you to consciously suffer the knowledge that you, too, are capable of the ruthlessness, the deceit, and the self-interest that you despise in others. This does not mean you act on these impulses. It means you recognize them as structural components of the human animal. You integrate the instinct, so it ceases to be an autonomous complex that can be triggered by external agents. If you refuse to integrate your own assertiveness, you will forever be drawn to the bully who acts it out for you. If you refuse to integrate your own capacity for cunning, you will forever be prey to the professional manipulator. The path of individuation demands a profound and brutal honesty. It demands that you stop playing the game of innocence. Innocence is a liability. It is a psychological vacuum that the unconscious will always seek to fill with external conflict. When you look into the abyss of your own repressed contents, you will see the blueprint of the toxic person who haunts you. They are merely a walking, talking symptom of your own structural disunity. The ultimate measure of your psychological sovereignty is not how well you avoid toxic people, but how little they affect you when they appear. If they can still destabilize you, if your hands still shake when they leave the room, it means the complex is still running the show. You must stop seeking external validation or external solutions. The problem is internal, and the solution must be internal. You must deliberately and ruthlessly kill the internal need to be perceived as good or nice. If those qualities are merely a cover for repressed cowardice and unlived aggression, until you integrate the shadow, until you take back the power you have projected onto the external world, you will remain a battery, a source of supply for anyone who understands the mechanics of your broken psyche. The only way to silence the manipulator is to render their tools inert, and their tools are your unintegrated complexes. Integrate them, now, or prepare for the cold silence of your own inevitable psychological collapse. The path to psychological sovereignty is not paved with affirmations or forgiveness. It is paved with the cold, hard truth of what resides within your own structure. We speak of the individuation process, the painful, necessary surgery required to become whole, to become immune. The neurosis that makes you a perpetual victim to the manipulator is the same neurosis afflicting modern civilization, the refusal to carry the weight of your own darkness. You want to be purely light, purely good, purely nice. This is not morality. This is a psychological lie, a flimsy persona built on the massive repression of everything you judge as unacceptable. Your unlived aggression, your capacity for ruthlessness, your instinct for self-preservation at all costs. These are the contents shoved into the shadow, and what happens to contents that are repressed? They do not vanish. They gain autonomy. They become complexes autonomos, internal entities with a will of their own seeking expression. Since you refuse to integrate them consciously, they are projected outward. The toxic person you encounter, the liar, the saboteur, the emotional vampire, is simply the externalized image of the shadow you refuse to acknowledge. They are the walking, talking expression of your own structural disunity. When they strike, it is not just an external attack. It is your own repressed contents hitting you from the outside. That is why the wound is so deep, why your hands shake. It is a confrontation with yourself, mediated by an external agent. To dismantle the toxic person's power, you must first dismantle the projection screen. You must look into the abyss of your own shadow and accept, coldly and clinically, that you possess the same capacity for malice, or calculated cruelty, or indifference as the person draining your life force. This is the point where most people recoil. They fear that integrating the shadow means becoming evil. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Integration means bringing the contents into consciousness, subjecting them to the rational ego, and gaining control over them. You do not become the monster. You simply recognize the tools the monster uses, and you put them in a locked drawer. You gain the power of the negative, not to use it against others, but to use it as a psychological shield. The moment you know you could destroy someone, you no longer need their approval. The need for approval is the Achilles heel of the victim. Once this internal integration begins, the external dynamics change radically. The manipulator, the narcissist, the emotional terrorist, they rely on your predictable emotional reaction. They need your pain, your rage, your defense, your tears. These are the fuel, the supply that feeds their own fragile, hollow structure. Your ultimate psychological weapon is Santa Indifferenza, holy indifference. This is not simple apathy. It is a profound, conscious refusal to invest emotional energy in their complex. When they deploy their guilt-ridden statements, their passive-aggressive jabs, or their outright lies, you must register the information without allowing it to penetrate your core structure. Imagine the manipulator as a surgeon attempting to operate on you with a scalpel, but you have developed a skin of dense, inert psychological iron. The scalpel bounces off. They expected a scream. They get silence. They expected an argument. They get a flat, clinical acknowledgement of their statement, followed by a change of subject. This silence, this non-reaction, is a terrifying experience for the complex autonomo driving them. It is starvation. It is the sudden loss of significance. The manipulator needs to know they are central to your emotional reality. When you demonstrate, through pure behavioral neutrality, that they are merely background noise, a minor inconvenience, you break the circuit. The silence must be absolute. No explaining your boundaries. No justifying your decisions. No engaging with the narrative of their victimhood or their false superiority. Every word you speak in defense is a validation of their premise. Every attempt to reason with them is a gift of supply. Stop trying to fix the other person. Stop trying to teach them morality. That is their burden, not yours. Your burden is the development of your own consciousness. The individuation process is fundamentally an act of separation. It is the painful realization that you must stand alone, psychologically sovereign, against the collective neurosis. The mass, the herd, the collective unconscious, it always seeks to pull the individual back into its warm, comfortable soup of projection and shared delusion. The toxic person is often the vanguard of the collective, punishing you for daring to assert your individual existence. When you refuse to react, when you integrate your shadow and stop projecting your own capacity for power onto them, you cease to be a consumable resource. You become, quite simply, boring. This indifference is not a passive state. It is an active, focused deployment of psychological energy. It is the conscious decision to withhold the most vital resource they seek, your attention, your time, your emotional investment. This decision requires a massive internal sacrifice. You must sacrifice the fantasy of universal harmony. You must sacrifice the childish notion that if you are perfectly good, you will be perfectly safe. Safety comes from internal strength, not external compliance. The price of this sovereignty is often loneliness. The individual who has integrated their shadow and stands outside the collective neurosis is often perceived as cold, distant, or even arrogant by those still drowning in the mass. They cannot understand the internal structure that allows you to face conflict without collapsing. But this loneliness is the necessary price for freedom. It is the silence that follows the psychological victory. It is the quiet certainty that your reality is defined internally, not externally. If you continue to treat the toxic landscape as a misunderstanding that can be solved with empathy, you are willfully choosing your own ruin. You are choosing the psychological suicide of the self for the sake of maintaining a fragile, false persona of niceness. The ultimate test of your individuation is this. Can you look at the architect of chaos, the professional manipulator, and feel nothing but clinical observation? Can you maintain the silence? Can you refuse the reaction, even when the complex screams for release? If you cannot, then the complex autonomo still owns you. Get to work. The external battle will rage until the internal structure is consolidated. The time for bleeding is over. The time for psychological engineering is now. We have reached the clinical endpoint of this diagnosis. The instruments are put away, the structure of the disease is mapped, and the prognosis is delivered. The hard truth is this: the mechanisms of psychological defense we have discussed, the surgical silence, the refusal to project, the integration of the shadow, are not techniques for achieving happiness. They are necessary conditions for psychological survival. You now stand at a crucial, binary crossroads. On one side lies the immense, painful burden of consciousness. On the other, the seductive, comfortable slide into ruin. The majority of modern humanity chooses ruin, not because they desire destruction, but because they desperately crave comfort. They are terrified of internal friction. They believe that if they simply repress the uncomfortable truths, the instinctual drives, the capacity for cruelty within the shadow, the world will somehow reward their superficial decency. This is a fatal miscalculation. The refusal to face the internal abyss is not innocence. It is a form of psychological negligence. When you refuse to acknowledge the darkness within yourself, you guarantee that it will be projected outward, where it finds a convenient home in the toxic person standing right in front of you. That individual becomes the living embodiment of your own unintegrated contents. You hate them so much precisely because they reflect the parts of you that you have refused to claim. This avoidance feeds the collective neurosis. We are witnessing an epidemic of psychic fragmentation because the individual refuses to take responsibility for their own internal structure. Instead, they demand that society, their partners, or their government provide a padded cell for their fragile ego. This demand for external safety in the face of internal anarchy is the definition of modern neurosis. Look at the structure of the complex autonomo. It is a splinter of the psyche, energized by repressed trauma, operating with a will of its own. When you interact with a manipulator, you are not engaging with their fully conscious self. You are engaging with their complex. And the moment you react emotionally, the moment your hands start shaking after a seemingly innocuous conversation, you have proven that your own complexes are equally active and easily triggered. You are not losing to an evil person. You are losing because your internal defenses are compromised, and their complex has successfully hooked yours. The work of individuation is the only lasting inoculation against this contagion. It is the cold, objective process of consolidating the self, making your consciousness the central governing authority of your own internal landscape. This requires a profound psychological sacrifice, the sacrifice of the persona that demands universal approval. You must kill the part of you that still believes in the fairy tale of universal harmony. That part is a liability. It is the battery the manipulator drains. When you stop giving away your emotional reaction, when you stop justifying, explaining, or pleading, you have removed the fuel source. The complex autonomo, starved of its required energy supply, begins to wither. It is a clinical fact, but understand the price of this sovereignty. When you become psychologically whole, when you stop bleeding and start standing on your own internal structure, the herd will perceive you as alien. They are addicted to the drama, the projection, and the mutual enabling of neurosis. When you withdraw, you disrupt their equilibrium. They will label you cold, detached, even arrogant. This is simply the collective's judgment of an individual who has chosen the difficult path of psychological reality over the comforting illusion of the mass. Accept the loneliness. It is the necessary silence that follows the psychological victory. It means you are no longer defined by the external noise or the desperate need for validation. Your reality becomes defined internally. This is the cold, hard truth. You must become your own ultimate authority, or you will remain a casualty in someone else's internal war. You cannot afford to treat this as a philosophical exercise. This is a medical emergency for the soul. The toxic landscape is simply a mirror reflecting the unexamined life. If you continue to treat the snake like a puppy, do not be surprised when you are bitten, repeatedly, until nothing is left of your self-esteem. The time for bleeding is over. The time for sentimentality is past. The illusion of safety through niceness is a psychological suicide pact. The question is not whether you are capable of doing this work. Every healthy psyche possesses the potential for consolidation. The real question is whether you are willing to endure the pain of self-confrontation. Are you prepared to look at the shadow and say, "Yes, that capacity for destruction is mine, and I will integrate it, so it cannot be projected onto others or exploited by them"? If you neglect what is being done to you for the sake of maintaining the fragile fantasy of what ought to be done, you guarantee your own psychological dissolution. You will remain a host for autonomous complexes, both your own and those projected onto you by others. You will continue to confuse clinical weakness with moral superiority, and you will continue to lose. The ultimate test is silence. Can you look into the eyes of chaos and maintain a clinical, non-reactive stillness? Can you deny the complex the energy it craves? If you cannot, then you must get to work. The external conflict will persist until the internal structure is consolidated. Stop participating in the collective neurosis. Stop being a predictable component of the psychological machine. Break the pattern. If you are serious about abandoning the collective delusion and consolidating the structure of your own psyche, then you understand that this is not a journey for the masses. This is a commitment to the painful clarity of the real. If you are ready to stop being a casualty and start being an analyst of your own life, if you are ready to exit the epidemic of neurosis, the work starts now. Subscribe to the discipline required for consciousness.